Hey guys, it's Belle, and in this video I'm going to be reading through and translating the whole of the life of Julian of Toledo, which was written by his successor Felix Toledo. So this is the account of the life of a saint who lived in the Visigothic era in Spain, and it's pretty interesting because it might be an indication of the kinds of forms that Adelpho-poetic relationships might have taken in the Latin West. Now, their existence in the Latin West is not a certain thing within history. It's some of the rites that have been found for them are from later periods in the Visigothic era, but nonetheless, it's a possibility that they were in a similar kind of arrangement, let's say, and we'll see that as we go through the text, which is why I'm covering it during June. So, let's get into it. And as usual, if you want to pause the video and have a go at translating it on your own using the gloss, feel free to do so. So, Julianus discipulus Eugeni Secundi, Carthaginis provinciae metropolitanus, post beate memoriae quiricum quarto in loco preceptorem suum sequens, urbis regiae pontificale culmen adeptus est, cuius fidelicet civitatis proprius civis existit, atque in eius de urbis principali ecclesia sacrosancti baptismatis fluentis est lotus, et illic ab ipsis rudimentis infantiae nutritus. So, what does all of this mean? We'll tackle this first clause here. Julianus discipulus Eugeni Secundi. Julian was the disciple of Eugenius II. This is the Eugenius of Toledo, whose poetry I've covered quite a bit on this channel. Carthaginis provinciae metropolitanus, the metropolitan of the province of Carthage. Post beate memoriae quiricum quarto in loco preceptorem suum sequens. Let's go with the sequens here because that's nominative singular and it's going with Julianus and metropolitanus. So, following sequens, post quiricum preceptorem suum, after Quiricus his teacher. Beate memoriae, he was of blessed memory. Quarto in loco, in the fourth place. Urbis regiae pontificale culmen adeptus est. So he took up the pontifical peak, so the highest religious office, Urbis regiae, of the royal city. This is referring to Toledo. Cuius fidelicet civitatis proprius civis exitit. Of which city cuius civitatis videlicet, namely, proprius civis exitit. He existed as a true citizen. So Julian of Toledo grew up in Toledo, let's say. So when he was appointed to be the bishop in this place, it wasn't strange, basically. It wasn't a kind of carpet bagging. Atque in eustem urbes principali ecclesia sacrosancti baptismatis fluentis est lotus. Let's go with the est lotus here, because that's actually our main, it's our nominative and our verb of the sentence. So he was washed, basically. In principali ecclesia, he was washed in the principal church, eustem urbis, of the same city, sacrosancti baptismatis fluentis, of sacred flowing baptism, basically. So he was baptized in the head church in Toledo. Et illic ab ipsis rudimentis infantiae nutritus. And in that church, he was nutritus, he was nourished ab ipsis rudimentis, from these foundations infantiae, of infancy. So this might imply that he was raised as a monastic child, so as a novitiate, rather than being raised in the world, this Julian of Toledo. And now we get on to the part with the relevance to Pride Month, so let's go. Denique dum ad puerilis forme devenisset etatem, sancti memoriae colleges sui Gudilanis levite, ita sociali vinculo est innexus, et individue caritatis unione conjunctus, ut et ambos inviolabilis caritas unum esse ostenderet, et unitas in ambobus prefixa non duas animas, sed una mis in esse monstraret. tantaitaque erat in reos adepteum amitatis communio, ut secundum macrum apostolorum historiam in duobus corporibus unum corda tantum puraretur anima una. Sistevant quippe in consilio providi et in definitione uni, in laudabili operatione concordes, quique divino afflante spiritu theoretice ides contemplative quietis delectati sunt perfuri bonno, et monastice institutiones constringere pagulo. So, what does all of this mean? This is basically a whole life together. This first clause, denique dum ad puerilis forme devenicitatem, is actually somewhat difficult for me to translate, but I'm going to interpret this as him having moved past boyhood. But literally it is, and then when devenicet, he had arrived ad etatem, at the age puerilis forme, of boy-like shape. Now, the reason I'm sort of saying that I think this means that he has gone past childhood and he's like roughly in adolescence is that I feel like he would have been in a sort of puerilis forma, in a sort of boy-like shape when he's a literal boy being baptized and such. He would have been an infant and then a boy. I don't know, I just feel like it seems more plausible that this is like him coming out of his boy years. But I should point out that the text does literally say that he had come to the age of boy-like shape, basically. So part of the reason I think that it means coming out of it is that what we get here is a rather serious, lifelong commitment to somebody, which I wouldn't expect to happen for a literal boy, as in younger than 15, which was considered their age of majority. So what happens in this next clause? Sancti memoriae collegae suae Gurilanis levite, ita sociali vinculo est inexus. Goodness. So, est inexus, he was enmeshed sociali vinculo by a social bond, sancti memoriae collegae suae Gurilanis levite, of his colleague Gudila, the Levite of holy memory, because by the time that this life is being written, Gudila is in fact dead. So when he'd reached boyhood age, let's say a boy-like form, he was connected in a sociale vinculo, in a social bond with this guy. Now, this word socialis is interesting because it often is also used to refer to marital partners, although that's quite notably not what is happening here. And this word vinculum as well is interesting because it echoes much of the language which is used in the Adelpho poetic rituals. If you remember back to the video I did going over the akoluthia from a ceremony for Adelpho poesis, the word used to describe the two men who were going to be joined in this ceremony was desmumeni, men who had been bound together. And likewise, vinculum in Latin means binds or fetters. So it's really interesting that this text is echoing some of the same kinds of ideas with Julian and Gudula as we saw in the Adelpho poetic Byzantine texts. And we do know from looking at the anonymous texts produced during the Visigothic period, and also from the high proportion comparatively of loan words within Visigothic texts which are taken from Byzantine Greek, we can see from all of these influences that there was a relatively large amount of contact between Byzantine literary culture, at least, and Visigothic Latin writers. So it wouldn't be too surprising if this was the product of some of these akoluthia being available in Visigothic Spain and being circulated as part of the literary culture. I'm not claiming that this is what happened, because that's not enough evidence to stake such a claim on, but I'm saying that could be a potential explanation for why this is in there. Et individuae carditatis unione conjunctus. So he was joined to in a social bond to his colleague Gudula of blessed memory, and he was conjunctus, connected. Now, of course, in Latin, conjux, the word for wife, and conjugia refers to marital relations, etc. So some of the language is echoing this here, and I've talked in the video on the Ecoluthia about what precisely the distinction would be between marriage per se, or marriage in its own right, and other kinds of relationships using similar kinds of language. But do bear in mind that marriage used much of the language of friendship from this time period, so a lot of the terms can be quite similar. For instance, in The Wife's Lament, the female narrator refers to her yemacha, which is a term almost exclusively used for husbands and wives, as having a friendship with her. So the terminology used for friends and marital partners can overlap, and this is partly why we have the word conjunctus here. So what this means, I should have explained, is conjunctus means he was joined. Unione individuae carditatis, in a union of singular charity, which is very sweet. And then this next clause describes what that union made it look like. Ut et ambos inviolabilis carditas unum esse ostenderet. So when we have ut, we normally have a subjunctive afterwards, and we do here, so that indicates intent or purpose. So it means so that inviolabilis carditas, inviolable charity, ostenderet, it would show. Ambos unum esse. Now this is kind of confusing because you've got two accusatives here, so you've got two objects and then an essay. This is not an accusative infinitive construction in this case, or at least not so much. So it means that he was joined in this bond to such an extent that ut et inviolabilis caritas, inviolable charity, ostenderet esse, would show that there was ambos unum. So they would show that the two men were one. So that's what is happening. So as a consequence of this social bond and this union of individual or undivided charity, it was seen that they were two men turned into one, essentially. Et unitas in ambobus praefixa non duas animas, sed unum is in esse monstraret. So, and fixed unity, monstraret in esse, would show that there were, in ambobus, in both of these men, non duas animas, not two souls, sed unum, but one. Tanta itaque erat inter eos adepte unanimitatis communio. Itaque erat means therefore there was, tanta communio, such communion or such fellowship, inter eos, among them, adepte unanimitatis, so there was such a fellowship of taken up unanimity, or single-mindedness. Ut secundum actum apostolorum historiam in duobus corporibus unum cor tantum putarvetur et anima una. So, we have another ut and a subjunctive here. So what this means is there was such a fellowship of taken up communion between them that putarvetur, it was reckoned unum cor tantum et anima una. It was deemed that there was only one heart and one soul in duobus corporibus, in two bodies, so in their two bodies, secundum actum apostolorum historiam, according to the history of the Acts of the Apostles. So this is referring to the account of Bartholomew and Philip in the Acts of the Apostles. So it's making a reference to that kind of friendship. And again, this is similarly echoing the language which is used in these Adelphopoetic Ecoluthia. So it's a really interesting hint that Felix of Toledo might have had access to some of these texts, or even that some of these texts might have, or some of these rituals might have existed within Visigothic Spain, and we simply no longer have record of them, which would be extremely interesting if further evidence were found to back up this claim. Sistebant quipe in concilio providi. So the honest men, sistebant, they carried on in concilio, in council, et in definitione uni, and singular, it's kind of hard to translate this uni because it's like, it's the plural form of the word for one, so it's like, they carried on as two, one. It's weird, but that's kind of the implication it's trying to get at. Two ones carried on. Okay, I can't communicate this. It's too weird. Just moving on. The honest men carried on in definition, so in limitation, in laudabili operatione concordes, agreeing with each other in praiseworthy work, laudabili operatione. Quique divino afflante spiritu theoretice ires contemplative quietis electati sunt per frui bono. So, we'll tackle this, quique delectati sunt. Those men who delectati sunt enjoyed, divino afflante spiritu theoretice contemplative quietis. So, the divine, with the divine blowing spirit of a theoretical, which is, again, a Byzantine Greek loanword. You don't so often see that in Latin, although you can have it, of course. Ides contemplative quietis, of a contemplative quiet. And the fact that this has to be glossed in Latin, I think suggests that Felix of Toledo is bringing this concept in from his reading of Greek texts, or very strongly Greek-influenced texts, but that these are terms which aren't as commonly encountered by a purely Latin reading audience. So they enjoyed, they delighted per frui bono, to enjoy the good things, et monastice institutionis constringere pagulo, and to be constrained by the bar, the sort of rule, monastice institutionis, of a monastic institution, which is yet another implication that this might be some kind of Western Latin echo or version of the Adelpha Poesis rituals seen in the Byzantine period around this time period. So, from start to finish, what this means is when Julian of Toledo had reached his teenage years, he was joined in a social bond to his colleague Gudera the Levite of holy memory, and he was joined to this man in a union of undivided charity, so that inviolable charity would show that both men were one, and prefixed unity would show that there were not two souls in these men, but one in two bodies. There was such fellowship of taken up unanimity among them, so that it was deemed that there was one heart and one soul in their two bodies, like what happened in the history of the Acts of the Apostles. 4. The honest men were carrying on in council and in limitation. In the praiseworthy operation, they were agreeing with each other. Mainly those men who delighted to enjoy the good things with the divine spirit of a theoretical and contemplative quiet blowing. And they also enjoyed to be bound by the bar of a monastic institution. So, that is describing how Julian of Toledo was joined in some kind of permanent and public union, because a lot of the language here is about what other people are going to think of this, right? Ostendere, monstrare. This is about how the community perceives their relationship. So my interpretation of this is that there was some degree of public ceremony to recognize the sociale vinculo, the social bond between Gudula and Julian. So, on to the third chapter. Sed quia aliter in superni numinis fuit judicio, eorem est nielominus frustrata devotio, quamquam tamen minime pervegissent desiderati tenere cursum, non tantum desierunt a pie devotionis studio, et dum sibi malent tantum progresse per fugam, ceperunt post modum proximorum salute votis licentibus niti. Erant enim subtilis docendis operosse virtutis, in profectu eorum desiderabiles, in servitute Dei ferventes, in desiderio recordis domus Domini strenui, in seniorum obedentia presto, atque si fieri posset, ut omnium emolumentorum obtinerent virtutum, animis ferventioribus studebant, igitur divinorum judiciorum dispensatione, sanctae recordationis Gudula diaconus, sexto septembris funeste mortis eventu, anno octavo ambanis principis sub digna confessione Dei clausit supremum curriculum, cuius corpusculum in monasterio sancti Felicis, quod est cabensi in villula dedicatum, dilectissimi soci sui exhibitione honorifice requiescitum atum. So, really long chapter, comparatively long compared to the others. What does all of it mean? This is a sad chapter, unfortunately. We get the kill off your gaze trope, even in the Middle Ages. Sed quia aliter in superni numinis fuit judicio. But since in judicio superni numinis, in the judgment of the supreme divine power, fuit aliter, it was meant to be a different way, basically. Eorum est nihil omnibus frustrata devotio. Their devotion was frustrated, frustrata est, it was made in vain, utterly. Quamquam tamen minime perlegissent desiderati itineris cursum. So, although, however, quamquam tamen minime perlegissent, in no way had they gone through cursum desiderati itineris, the course of their desired journey. So, presumably this is referring to they had not spent enough time as they would have liked to with each other. Non tamen desierunt a pie devotionis studio. They had not ceased a pie devotionis studio from the study of pious devotion, or from their zeal for pious devotion. Et dum sibi malent tantum progresse per fugam. So, and while it was, I suppose, preferable for them prodesse to avail per fugam in flight, ceperunt post modum proximorum salute votis licentibus niti. So they began, after a while, to advance, basically, niti salute proximorum, the health of their neighbors, votis licentibus, with shimmering prayers, which is a rather nice metaphor for it. Now this, so basically what this is saying, although they would have preferred to only look after each other, basically, while they would prefer only to avail sibi each other per fugam in flight, so running away from everyone else, ceperunt post modum proximorum salute votis licentibus niti, they began after a while to advance the well-being of their neighbors with their prayers. Erant enim in subditis docendis operose virtutis. So they were in subditis docendis, in secret teachings operose virtutis, of effective virtue, in profectue eorum desiderabiles, desirable in the enactment of them, of those virtues, basically. In servitude Dei ferventes, they were eager in the service of God. In desiderio recordis domus Domini strenui, in the desire of the house, and then decordis is like that which is appropriate. I am fairly sure. In the desire for the glory or the appropriateness. In desiderio decordis domus Domini strenui, in desire for the glory of the house of the mighty God. So you've got literally 3 genitives here, which makes it a bit hard to get through sometimes. In seniorum obedientia presto. They were present in the obedience of their elders. Atque si fieri posset, and if it could come to be, ut omnium emolumentorum obtinerent virtutum. That's an interesting. Animis ferventioribus studebant. So if they might obtain of the virtues of all monuments. So I assume that there's an implied accusative here. So if they could obtain something of all the emoluments of virtues, studebant animis ferventioribus, they would strive towards that with fervent souls. Igitur divinorum iudicorum dispensatione, sancte recordationis gudula diaconus, sexto ido septembris funeste mortis eventu. So, therefore, Gudula the deacon, divinorum iudiciorum dispensatione, by the dispensation of divine judgments, sexto idus septembris, on the 6th day before the Ides of September, eventu funeste mortis, by the event of a funerary death or a lamentable death. Anno octavo Wambanis principis, in the 8th year of the rule of Prince Wamba, sub digna confessione Dei, under the worthy confession of God. So presumably this is referring to the fact that Gudula had last rites and said confession before death. Clausit supremum curriculum. He, put a close to his ultimate path, his ultimate journey. Cuius corpusculum in monasterio Sancti Felicis, whose body in the monastery of Saint Felix, quod est cabensi in villula dedicatum, his body which was dedicated, or the monastery rather, which was dedicated at Cabens, in the villa of Cabens. The body Directissimi soci sui exhibitione, by the exhibition of his beloved friend, honorifice requiesce domatum. It rests, having been buried, by the exhibition of his beloved friend, honorifice, honorably. So, really sad stuff. It doesn't actually give any indication of why he died, but what this is sort of saying is that Julian and Felix of Toledo living together, although they would have preferred to just spend all their time with each other and not really pay attention to anybody else, they started to benefit everybody around them with their glowing prayers, which is quite sweet. And they were just very good monks, essentially. They were desirable in the enactment of virtue, they were eager in the service of God, etc., etc. And then, really sadly, Gudula died and Julian had to bury him. Sad face stuff. So we now go on to the rest of Julian's life, and most of the rest of this text actually pertains to the books that Julian wrote. So we'll be going over many of the later chapters comparatively quickly. So, yeah. Post eos itaque dicessum, aliquantula inter capedine temporum, post sancte memoriae quiricum idem egregius Julianus prefate urbis est unctus primatu, tanto laudes titulo predicandus, quanto diversarum virtutum opus suffultus, suis temporibus mirifice composuit ecclesiam Dei. Qui nimo ut ex quo tempore clarescere ceperit, per unc textadinum et telam stammine per rationes pandam. Post decessorde sue obitum divine memoriae Hildefonsi, a 17º ferme anno, reces vinti principes necron et per omne ambones imperii tempus, usque a tertium regni gloriosissimi ecce canis regis annum in Levitici presbyteri ac pontificatus honore consistens celebre nomen obtenuit. So, what does all of this mean? So, post eos vitaque dicessum, after the departure of this man, aliquantera inter capadine temporum, with a little interval of times, post sanctam memoriae Quiricum idem, after Quiricus of holy memory, idem egregius Julianus, the same amazing Julian, prefate urbis est unctus primatu, he was joined to the primacy of that same city. So, what he's saying is that Julian of Toledo became the Bishop of Toledo a little while after Gudula had died. Tanto laudis titulo predicandus, one who must be spoken of with such a title of praise, quanto diversarum virtutum ope suffultus, because he was suffused. Now, there's no word for because here, just bear in mind, but this is implied. Having been suffused, quanto ope, with so much work, basically, diversarum virtutum, of various virtues. Suis temporibus mirifice composuit ecclesiam Dei. So there's no nominative in this clause because the nominative is carried over from before. It's the egregius Julianus. So amazing Julian composuit, he put together ecclesiam Dei, the Church of God, mirifice, marvelously, suis temporibus, in his times. Qui nemo ut, indeed, so that ex quo tempore clarescere ceperit, from the time in which he had begun to glisten, or began to shine or become famous, per hunc textrinum et telam, through this cloth and weave. This is referring to presumably the text here, because remember the Latin word textus just refers to technically a thing which is weaving a story, so to speak. So through this weave and cloth, stamine per relationis pandam, I will extend it with the thread of pious relation. So what he's saying, what Felix of Toledo is saying, is that he is going to extend the story, basically, through the thread of pious relation. So by describing the people who Julian had professional relations with. Post decessordis sui obitum divine memoriae Hildefonsi. So after the death post obitum decessordis sui divine memoriae Hildefonsi, of his predecessor Hildefons of divine memory, a 17º ferme anno retis vinci principis, from the almost the 17th year, 17º anno, recis vinti principes, of Prince Regis Winth, nec non et per omne bonis imperii tempus, and also throughout every time of the empire, which is the kingdom in this case, of Wambo, all the way ad tertium regni gloriosissime Canis regis annum, to the third annum year, regni gloriosissime Canis regis, of the rule of the most glorious king Egican, in Levitici presbyterii ac pontificatus honore consistens, so consisting or carrying on in honore, in the honor, Levitici presbyterii ac pontificatus, of the Levitehood, the priesthood, and the bishopric, basically. So these are the three titles that Julian had in his lifetime. Celebre nomen obtenuit. He obtained a famous name, essentially. So There we go. After the death of his beloved friend Gudela, Julian of Toledo went on to achieve great things and had a very illustrious career. And now this is getting on to essentially repeating what we had earlier with him and Gudela, except that instead of talking about both of their virtues, it's talking about Julian alone in his virtues. And you can probably tell from just the colours alone that it's rather repetitive in its form, so I'm going to be relatively quickly going through this. But first I'll read the Latin from start to finish, as I am accustomed to do here. Fuit enim vir timore Domini plenus, prudentia sumus, consilio cautus, discretionis bono principius, eleemosinis nimium deditus, in revelatione miserordem promptissimus, in suffectu oppressorem devotus, in interveniendo discretus, in negotiis dirimendis strenus, in providendis judicis equus, in sententia parcus, in vindicatione justitiae singulares, in discrepatione laudabilis, in oratione iuges, in divinarum laudum exolutione mirabilis, quasi forsan in officis divinis, quidquam ut sole difficultatis occurreret, ad corrigendum facilimus pro sacris luminibus vehementar harmonitus, in defensione omnium ecclesiardum eximius, in regendis subditus per vigil, in compremiendi superbis erectus, in sustenatione humilium apparatus, debita auctoritate munificus, amplectande humilitatis bono opimus, ac generaliter universum mordum probitate conspicuus, in pietate affluens et non esset cui in angustis constituto non symphonire rivellet, ita unius caritatis exuberans, ut non asse boni quid piam cuique postulanti ex caritate prestare resisteret, sic denique se Deo carum maluit exhibere in omnibus, et prestabile omnibus cuncti sustendere, ut et illi usqueque placeret, et hominibus propter Deum si fieri potest, devoto satisfactare mente. Tanto nobilium predicentum virordum dignis meritis coequans, quanto abeis in nulla virtutum corpore exitit infimus. Goodness. So, what does all of this mean? So, fuit enim, that's probably the most important because that is the one verb that's going to take us all the way down to the end here, quod si forsan. So, fuit enim means for he was. And then we have a bunch of nominatives, as we can see from the yellow, and then we have a bunch of ablatives and sometimes a genitive describing things. So, let's get on it. Vir, he was a man, basically. Timore Domini plenus, filled with the fear of God, prudentia summus, the highest in prudence or wisdom, consilio cautus, cautious in his advice, discretionis bono principius, I guess eager in the good of discretion, or excellent in the good of discretion, elemosinis nimium deditus, excessively given to charity, in revelatione miserordum promptissimus, most ready or most eager in the relief of misers, of the poor. In suffectu oppressorem devotus, devoted to the relief of the oppressed, basically. In interveniendo discretus, discreet in his interventions. In negotiis dirimendis strenus, he was hard-working in his businesses. In providendis judicis equus, he was fair in giving judgment, which as a bishop he would often be required to do. In sententia parcus, he was sparing in his judgments. In vindicatione justitiae singulares, he was singular in the vindication of his justice. In disceptatione laudabilis, he was praiseworthy in disceptatione, in discussion. In oratione iuges, he was joyful in speech. In divinarum laudum exolutione mirabilis, and he was miraculous in the, well, this is one of those weird ones that makes sense to monks, but doesn't make sense to ordinary people. I'm not a monk, but I picked it up from them, which is like exolving or persolving. But so in saying the divine praises, divinarum laudum, he was miraculous in saying the divine prayers. So maybe he was a good singer. Quod si forsan in officiis divinis, quidquam ut solet difficultatis occurreret. So, because if perhaps during the divine offices anything of difficulty, quidquam difficultatis ut solet, as sometimes would happen, occurreret, would come to pass, ad corrigendum facilimus, he was very easy at correcting it, or very good to correct it. Pro sacris luminibus vehementet admonitus, having or advising people eagerly or violently even on behalf of the sacred lights or for the sacred lights. In defensione omnium ecclesiarum eximius, he was excellent in defense of all the churches. In regendis subditis per vigil, so he was vigilant essentially. In regendis per vigilis, in forsaken kingdoms, keeping his vigil in forsaken kingdoms. In comprimendis superbis erectus, which means he was upright in compromising prides, which is an interesting one. Presumably saying that he wasn't bowed down or crippled by prides. In sustenatione humilium apparatus, he was eager or ready for supporting the humble or raising up the humble. Debita auctoritate munificus, he was munificent or generous, debita auctoritate, with his owed authority. Amplectende humilitatis bono opimus, he was good in embracing his humility, basically. Wealthy, I should say, in the good of embracing others. Ac generali terre universam morum probitate conspicuus. But generally he was noteworthy with a universal appropriateness or righteousness of customs, morum. In pietate affluens, he was abounding in piety, ut non esset cui in angustis constituto non subvenire velet. Now this bit is kind of difficult to translate. So what this is so that ut non, and then esset, ut non esset, so that there was not, and then cui is anyone basically, constitutor, set up or like placed there in angustis, in the narrow places, and this is presumably referring to the narrow streets of Toledo, maybe even the alleys where he would go in his services to the poor, to whom non subvenire velet, he would not wish to come. And Augustis could also perhaps mean like in difficult times as well. So there was nobody who was going through hard times whom Julian of Toledo would not wish to go to. Ita unius caritatis exuberans, thus rejoicing in his singular charity or kindness, ut non a se boni quidpiam cuique postulanti ex caritate prestare destiteret. So this is another pretty difficult one. We've got another ut non, but then the subjunctive comes all the way at the end. So this means so that he would not desisteret, desist, prestare, or to provide quidpiam, anything, ase, from himself, boni, of good. So he would not delay to provide anything of good from himself, cuique postulanti, to anyone who is demanding it, ex caritate, out of charity or out of devotion or almsgiving. Sic denique se Deo carum maluit exhibere in omnibus. For thus maluit exhibere se, he preferred to exhibit himself, Deo, to God, carum, as a dear man, in omnibus, in all things. So what this means is, in this way, he preferred to show himself to God as a beloved man in all things, et praestabilem hominibus cuncti sostendere, and he preferred to show himself as praestabilem, which kind of means presentable basically to all men, or available hominibus cunctis to all men, ut et illi usqueque placeret, so that he was pleasing to them all, et hominibus propter Deum, he was pleasing to that man, rather, to that God, and also to men on account of God. Si fieri potes, and if it could come to be, devota satisfaceret mente, he would do anything that they wanted with a devoted mind. Tanto nobilium precedentium virorum, dinis meritis coequans, in such a manner coequans, equaling dinis meritis, the dignified merits, nobilium precedentium virorum, of the noble men who had gone before him, quanto ab eis in nullo virtutum corpore exitit infimus. So, even though exitit infimus, he was lesser than them, ab eis, in nullo virtutum corpore. So even though he was exitit infimus, lesser in his body, quanto ab eis in nullo virtutum, he was nonetheless lesser than them in none of the virtues. So what this is saying is, even though Julian of Toledo was a bit small physically, he was just as good in terms of his merits as the noble men who had come before him. And that is why he was able to be all of these very good things that the text lays out above. So, on to this chapter 6. Ecclesiasticos itaque bene habitos ordines in sui regimenis sede sollicitori cura servavit, vitatos utiliter subcorrexit, minus habitos prudenti dispositione instituit, ac de officis, quam plurima dulcifluos onno composuit, at nunc quoniam sancti spiritus ubertate repletus, et erigui fontis affluentia preditus fulgit, summam librorum eius, quos per eum Deus ad utilitatem ecclesiae suae deprompsit, istinc lector adice. So, what does all of this mean? So, servavit is our verb for the first clause, and it just means he served or he kept. Ecclesiasticos bene habitos ordines. He kept the ecclesiastical ranks well maintained. In sede sui regimenis, in the seat of his rule, sollicitori cura, with more urgent care. Vitiatos nulli utiliter subcorrexit. So vitiatus is an interesting word. It's sort of like the ones having fallen into vice, so people living in sin. Utiliter subcorrexit. He usefully corrected them. Minus habitos prudentii dispositione instituit. He, what's the word? Instituted these held, and these habitos, because it's repeating this word from earlier, it might be referring to those orders. So he instituted the orders prudenti dispositione, with wise disposition, ac de officis quam plurima dulcifluos sonno composuit, and quam plurima, many more things, de officis concerning his duties, dulcifluo sonno, with beautiful sound, composuit, he composed. And de officis could refer in this case to the monastic offices, saying that he wrote a lot of things about the divine offices and wrote texts which were composed with a dulcifluo sonno, sweet flowing sound, probably refers to poetry. And we do have some of Julian of Toledo's poetry surviving. So he composed many more texts for the divine office in poetic form. At nunc quoniam sancti spiritus ubertate repletus. So, yes, but now, because Repletus with an implied essay means he was filled, ubertate sancti spiritus, with an excess of the Holy Spirit or an abundance of the Holy Spirit. Et irregui fontis affluentia preditus fulxit. The man endowed with the affluens irregui fontes of the watered fountain, fulxit, he shone, or he shimmered. So, because this man was filled with an abundance of the Holy Spirit, and he shone with the affluence of the watered fountain, summam librorum eos, the summary of his books, quas per eum Deus ad utilitatem ecclesiae sue deprompsit, the books which, and we know this quas is referring to the books because it is masculine accusative singular, masculine accusative plural, and liber, it would be a masculine noun. So given that this is in the plural here, librorum, when it's in the accusative plural, that means it's probably referring to the masculine plural noun that came before it. So the books which, per eum, through him, Deus ad utilitatem ecclesiae sue deprompsit, God put forth. That's the important thing here, and that's why it's in the nominative, because God is actually putting these works out for the church, not Julian alone. But God is working per eum through him, ad utilitatem ecclesiae sue, for the utility of God's church. Estinc elector adice. From here, O reader, learn of these. And from here on, this is basically where Julian of Toledo's life itself actually ends. And then the rest of this is a long list of the books of Julian of Toledo, because he was a very prolific and distinguished writer in the Middle Ages. He wrote many works which were quite theologically influential, such as his Prognosticon of the Future Age. And just a quick note also, that this book, which he has written of De Contraris, concerning arguments against the Church, Pod Grege Antikymenon, volue titulo ad notari, he wanted to title this book with a Greek word. This is just indicating the extent to which Julian of Toledo had probably quite a good bit of Greek education as well, supporting the claim I'm making earlier that there might have been some degree of Byzantine influence in this story that Felix of Toledo has written. And then the rest of this is just a long list of the books, basically, that Julian of Toledo wrote. So I'm not going to cover these here because, frankly, it would be just very long and not too interesting for people. I will skip all the way to the end and read the final chapter 12, which describes his death and bring us to the end of this text. So, Presulatus autem honorem et sacerdoti dignitatem annis decim obtinuit mense uno diebus septem. Quique etiam inevitabilis mortis preventus occasu anno tertio Egecanis principi pridie nonas martii era septingentesima vigesima octava diem vitae clausit extremum, ac sic in basilica gloriosissime sancte Leocarie Virgine sordes sepulcrali est tumulatus. So, Presulatus autem honorem et sacerdoti dignitatem annis decim obtinuit. So, obtinuit means he obtained the honor and the dignity of the pontificate and the priesthood, respectively. Annis decim for 10 years, mense uno for 1 month, diebus septem in 7 days. So he ruled he managed things as a bishop for 10 years, 1 month, and 7 days. Quique etiam inevitabilis mortis preventus occasu. So he who preceded the occasion of inevitable death, anno tertio Egecanis principis, in the 3rd year of the rule of King Egecan, predie nonas martii, on the day before the nones of March, era septingentesima vigesima octava, in the year of our Lord, 708, 728. And just note that the Visigoths are, as I've said in other videos, comparatively early users of the Anno Domini format with this use of the word era here. Diem vitae clausit extremum. He shut, literally, and this is the same word that was used of Gudula earlier, diem extremum, the last day, vitae, of his life. So what this first clause is saying is like he had gone before the occasion of inevitable death. So it's almost implying that he had sort of lived longer than normally people would expect. So he lived a long life. And then finally he finished the last day of his life. Et sic in basilica gloriosissime sancte Leocadiae Virginis, and thus in the basilica of the most glorious Virgin Leocadia, sorte sepulcrali, by sepulchral fate, so by cemeterial fate, est tumulatus, he was buried. So we know from this that he died and / was buried on the day before the nones of March in the year 728. And there we go. That's the end of Julian of Toledo's life, given that we have skipped over the very long list of books that he created, fascinating though they are. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed that fascinating little look, particularly at chapter 2 on the relationship between Gudula and Julian, which I think was quite sweet. And I'm going to, at some point on this channel, be covering the epitaph that Julian wrote for Gudula, because, as you can imagine from this text, Julian was heartbroken, and the tombstone for Gudula is really quite touching. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want me to teach you Latin or any of the other languages that I teach on this channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which will be linked in the description of this video. And there I offer tuition at lower than market rates. You can also join my Discord server, where I tend to post these glosses as tidbits before I turn them into videos. And it's also just a fun community of like-minded people where we often have movie nights and we share memes with each other. It's good times. You should come and join us. And until next time, happy Pride Month, everyone, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, everyone.